Good morning, everyone. It's 9 o'clock in Paris. This is Asia Center speaking, and I'm Jean-François Di Meglio, President of Asia Center. I'm extremely glad and honored to welcome all of you today. It's quite an exceptional event. We are very proud to organize it. It's exceptional in many respects, but mostly because you were so numerous to answer positively to our invitation. As you know, today we will speak about EU-Korea relations. Of course, the world is full of many noises and many topics. Still, not only because it's 10 years now into the European Union-Korea foreign trade agreement, but also because we consider that it's very important at this juncture that geographical areas like European Union and Asia, East Asia, and more specifically a country like Korea, which displayed a tremendous attitude during the pandemics, know each other much better. And this is why we took the opportunity of organizing this webinar. Supposedly it was a seminar, as you all know. We received tremendous papers, excellent quality. I would like first of all to thank all the academics who contributed. The participants, almost 100 people today from many countries in Europe, are supposed to have read the papers. So I would explain a few items in the methodology today. We have two panels. Before the first panel, we will have a keynote speaker whom I will introduce. And thereafter, we split our talk into two panels. The Q&A session will take place after the two panels, and in between, we have a guest speaker, Dr. Elisabeth Suh, and she will speak about cyberspace and North Korea. We have shut down the access to voice for the participants. As you know, we received the questions beforehand, but you are allowed to ask questions in writing after the panels. And we will take the questions and we will answer each of the participants after the panels. As a last recommendation, and before we start, and I hand over the speech to Lukas Mandl, I would ask the speakers to speak for 7 minutes maximum, because as you know, we only have 2 hours, 7 minutes. You don't have to read your contribution. Your contributions have been read by the participants. 7 minutes. And please, you may want to wear masks as long as you want, but when you talk, it's preferable not to wear masks, of course. I'm very glad now to introduce Lukas Mandl. Lukas Mandl is the chair of the EU-Korea delegation at the European Parliament, and he is our keynote speaker before our first panel, which will be chaired by Mr. André de Bussy, whom I will introduce later. Lukas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-François. I hope all of you can hear me, and also from my side, I wish all of you a good morning in these times to Paris and to all over the world, wherever you may be. Jean-François Di Meglio and the Asia Center did a great job in organizing this. It's so important to strengthen relations, especially in these times of the pandemic and everything that's coming, and it will be hard for economy all over the world, but strengthening ties means a lot. Jean-François, you mentioned we only have 7 minutes. That's 7 times as much as we usually have in the European Parliament, so it will be easy for me to keep within the timetable. I look forward to all the contributions of the experts, because it will help also us in our parliamentary work in what we call parliamentary diplomacy, which is so important, not only for let's say, a normalization between the two countries on the Korean Peninsula, but even more than that, to even more strengthen the ties with Korea, with South Korea. And that's so important because South Korea is one of only 10 strategic partners of the European Union, and it's the only one with agreements in the fields of politics, in the field of economy, and in the field of security. And this is really exceptional. And the free trade agreement has achieved a lot in terms of rising numbers on both sides, in Korea and in European Union, in mutual trade relations, and it created jobs. And that's something we have to talk about and to work on, especially to work on in the pandemic and afterwards, because what we face is an economic crisis all over the world. Maybe that's something that makes it easier to work with each other properly, but we have to face things, and partners like Korea for the European Union, which share our common values, democracy, rule of law, based on a sense of human dignity, based on a sense of individual freedom, of economic freedom generally. A partner like Korea is extremely important, even more important than ever before during this crisis, and that's why it's so important to work on this. And Korea is also an example of dealing with the pandemic in terms of the health issues, and it has been this example from the very beginning. That's why there's again another point why we should have a close look on how Korea is dealing with things, and share our experience, share our approaches, and do our utmost to do the best for the health of our people in Europe, in Korea, and all over the world. We also face security threats in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, and that's why I really appreciate that Korea is also a strong partner in terms of security. Korea is in the position to participate in EU's peacekeeping missions, and this is also a field where we can work together. As you may know, in my home country, Austria, we had a terrible terrorist attack last week, and that's why, especially in these days, I appreciate very much that Korea is also a partner in this field. And when we talk about economic crisis, we should not forget about the fact that not each and everybody on this planet shares our values, democracy, rule of law, etc., but is intervening in terms of economy in many different areas of business. And that's why it's important that we share our values, and we connect and cooperate in as much areas of business as we can, since our societies and our states are based on these values. That's why I will closely listen to what the experts have to say today. I already look forward to it, and I will include it in my parliamentary work as a chair of the delegation with the Korean Peninsula and European Parliament. Thanks again to the Asia Center, and now I hand over the floor to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Thank you very much for your words and for opening this session. We will now move on to the first panel. The first panel is chaired by Mr. André Debussy. I'm extremely glad and honored that Mr. André Debussy accepted to be the chair for this first panel. His Asian experience is extensive. He's been a diplomat in many countries in East Asia, and he also chaired the Elisabeth group for the G7 and G20 meetings in 2011. His political experience in France is very broad, but now he also has a very deep root in the cultural world in France, as his position in the municipality of Boulogne, which is part of the Greater Paris and a key part of the Greater Paris, hosts an important center for cultural meetings, and possibly when everything settles down, we hope that some of the further sessions of the group which is constituted now may take place in Boulogne in the frame of this cultural center. André, the floor is yours, and you will be the moderator for the first session. Thank you very much, André.
Good morning, everyone. The next panel is going to be introduced by Dr. Maximilian Meyer of the University of Bonn, CASSIS project. Dr. Meyer, you have 7 minutes, I've been told, and 6 minutes. At the 6th minute, I will just give you a little signal to tell you there is 1 more minute to cover. Question to Dr. Meyer, if I may. According to you, what are the major geopolitical trends for EU and South Korea to take into account? And what points of convergence are you considering regarding these two actors? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, and certainly also for some good afternoon. I guess we're also having audience in Asia. Let me begin my intervention by thanking the entire team of Asia Center in Paris to organizing that panel and making our discussion possible. I think it's extremely timely discussion, and we should have more of those. For this first panel today, I want to contemplate as a couple of points of convergence, and that's also encouraged, of course, by the theme of the panel. I want to emphasize especially 4 overarching trends in order to clarify the common interests among South Korea, the European Union, and also its member states. And of course, the goal is also to understand better potentials for working towards common solutions, as well as the need to become a closer partner. The first global tendency, which is highly relevant for both sides, is, of course, China's continued rise and its political ramifications, especially for countries with a high economic interdependence with China. China's foreign policy has become more assertive, and its internal policies from Xinjiang to Hong Kong and so forth are becoming more contested internationally. Territorial claims have led recently to territorial conflicts and military standoffs with India, with Nepal, but also ongoing in the South China Sea. At the same time, Chinese leadership under the powerful President Xi Jinping follows grander and more ambitious schemes. Some in China began openly to articulate a claim of superiority of the socialist political system. And Chinese propaganda during the pandemic has a very triumphalist sound and vibe. And the comparison of China's pandemic crisis response with Europe and the US, of course, suggests that China, not only South Korea, but also China had a huge success in controlling the pandemic. And yet, despite a very energetic health diplomacy and the provision of materials and tests and other needed items for many countries, including some countries in Europe, such as Serbia or Italy, China's public image globally, especially in democratic countries, turns increasingly negative. Meanwhile, the United States strategy for quite some time, and with a broad bipartisan support, aims to engineer an economic decoupling from China and to deny China market access and core technologies in order to slow down China's dynamic development. The problem is that many countries around the world are so deeply interconnected and reliant on the Chinese market economically that the price of confrontation and the price of decoupling appears impossible to pay. Hence, there is a split between economic and political realities, and that is particularly strong for South Korea and some European countries. And that split, I would argue, will only widen in the coming years as China's power, ambitions, and assertiveness grows. The strategic dilemma resulting from Sino-US antagonism illustrates the kind of challenges that come typically with world order transition. This unsettling process of reassembling and regrouping is happening not only in terms of a regional order, but for the entire world order. Naturally, the partial retreat of the United States, the waning of the liberal hegemonic project, produces an anxiety in the West, while geopolitical tensions are rising in various regions. The transformation of order is perhaps especially rapid and pronounced in East Asia and in the Middle East. But you can also find it, of course, with regards to the diplomacy of European Union and some of the member states. For example, Germany's new Indo-Pacific strategy paper and the European Commission's new focus on strategic autonomy are expressions of that same turbulences. The same is true for Japan's strategic decision to fund the diversification of foreign direct investments away from China, something the Korean government is also trying a little bit. But also the formalization of military cooperation by the Quad countries. Moreover, the resulting fragility of many international institutions, exemplified by the World Health Organization during the pandemic, but also the bilateralization of trade negotiations that make the World Trade Organization less and less relevant. All of these indicates the magnitude of changes and is a measure of the consequent rise of insecurity. And that insecurity also springs, I'm convinced, from the lack of a roadmap for the stabilization of those institutions on a global and on a regional level, or at the minimum, on an agreement about the way forward to realize a coexistence in a world of growing ideological antagonism. A third and important large-scale trend is digitalization and datafication. The radical impacts of this global transformation are already visible, and yet we might only be at the beginning of the algorithmic revolution. South Korea here again might be in a leading position as compared to many and maybe most European states. Its negative and its positive, rich experiences are highly illuminating and should be learned from on the European side. The design and application of new technologies ranging from social media to AI application, from cryptology to sensory clothes, and the merging of digital nanotech and even gene editing poses a fundamental challenge. It creates great difficulties especially for democratic societies. And we have yet to find a sustainable balance between civic values, democratic processes, and the evolving technological possibilities as well as their abuse. Finally, the rapid evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic, as has been already mentioned, shows the crucial importance of non-traditional security challenges. The reaction by most states was, against the suggestions of the World Health Organization, slow and deeply nationalistic, focused on the national context. The level of international cooperation is definitely not enough, and we have failed to harness so far the power of international coordination and collaboration for public health policy. One can only hope that the distribution of the vaccine will be organized in a more cooperative and responsible manner. Even among European Union member states, cooperation on epidemic containment, on testing, on border control and so forth, at certain points decreased dramatically. Clearly, Europeans can learn a lot from South Korea in handling the crisis, as many of the papers in our panel today will point out in more detail. The need for mutual learning and the constant monitoring what the other side is doing goes far beyond the current epidemic situation, of course. In the age of the Anthropocene, nature, whether in the form of infectious diseases or in the form of the climate system, is merged with society, just as politics and technology are more and more inseparable. To develop proper set of global ethics and a stable political practice for coping and living through such non-traditional security threats that are both effective and democratically legitimate is perhaps the most fundamental challenge converging for the governance of democratic societies in East and West in a post-pandemic world. And that post-pandemic world, be sure, is also a world where climate change catastrophes are looming and other large-scale dangers are constantly present. These four trends showcase a convergence that is not only of academic interest, but indeed already reflected in numerous policy discussions and also current ongoing debates in South Korea and the European Union member states. What is sometimes missing in this regard and could get improved through events like this one and others is the mutual knowledge and understanding about those issues, how to respond and which possible policy alignments are achievable. In this sense, I believe that the following discussions and the analysis provided by my co-panelists are extremely helpful and will shape the discussion and the questions and answers we have later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meyer. Pünktlich, 7 Minuten, mehr nicht. The second panelist, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Antoine Bondaz, Foundation for Strategic Research, SciencesPo. The COVID-19 pandemic as a great opportunity for greater EU-Korea coordination and cooperation. Dr. Bondaz, as your paper is focusing on the challenges posed by China within the pandemic and beyond, what are the implications of Chinese foreign policy on EU-South Korea relations? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I will try to be very complimentary to what Maximilian has been saying. But first and foremost, thank you very much to Asia Center and everyone to make that event possible. It's always very important to have as much as possible EU-Korea coordination and cooperation, and that event, virtual event, will be key for that. So I argued in my paper that the COVID-19 pandemic occurs in a context of multi-dimensional confrontation and systemic rivalry between the United States and China, and that the COVID-19 pandemic is an eye-opener and a catalyst for pre-existing trends in China's foreign policy, but also for the European awakening on the challenges China poses. In that context, there is a unique opportunity to increase coordination and cooperation, not only between the European Union and Korea, but also between EU member states and Korea. So first, the US-China confrontation is neither only about security, nor only about politics. Even before the Trump administration, a bipartisan consensus was emerging in the US. And the Biden administration is indeed very unlikely to reverse that course. It is a long-term confrontation that is both multidimensional and a systemic rivalry. It's a multidimensional confrontation that could be divided into 4 separate but overlapping domains: geostrategic, economic, technological, and governance. It is also a competition about values and models going much further than just a competition between a democratic and an authoritarian system. Europeans do share that assessment in presenting China since 2019 as a cooperation partner, a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and also a systemic rival. In that context, neither a one-fit-all coalition nor a united anti-China front are likely. If the Trump administration actively supported such a scenario, both Europeans and Koreans opposed it. As such, there will be no alliance of democracies that covers all of these 4 areas, since national interests are too disparate. Instead, separate issue-based coalitions are likely to emerge. Second, China's behavior during the pandemic has raised international concern and has further deteriorated the image of the country to an all-time low in most European countries, as well as in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Korea. China implemented a clear strategy at the outbreak of the pandemic in the end of January, whose objective was not simply media-related to restore China's image internationally, but political, to highlight the superiority of the Chinese model of governance and therefore of the Communist Party over Western model of governance. China has been very proactive in trying to impose its own narrative, a so-called global battle of narrative, as labeled by High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell. This unprecedented communication campaign perfectly fits into what Xi Jinping called in August 2013 during the National Conference on Propaganda and Ideological Work, when he said, "We must methodically conduct external propaganda work to better tell China's story and make China's voice heard." Chinese diplomats are not only more vocal, but also more aggressive and openly using this information. In France, there has been so many insults and baseless accusations against journalists and lies to the public that the ambassador was summoned by the French government mid-April. China also used the opportunity presented by the pandemic to promote its health diplomacy and its industrial capacities to achieve political, diplomatic, and economic objectives. China's health diplomacy is indeed not only a tool of influence, but also a means of promoting Chinese companies abroad. It left a strong first impression in Europe when, mid-March, China was the first country to send protective equipment to Italy. That diplomacy displayed our shortages and shortfalls and opened the eyes of many European decision makers on the need to increase our resilience, diversify our import partners on essential goods especially, and reduce our dependency on China. Meanwhile, even though Korea has been less visible, it did offer hundreds of thousands of masks, including 20,000 masks to French veterans of the Korean War. Korea is also a country with great capacities in the field of health, and the use of new technologies has played a key role in the management of the pandemic in the country. As Minister Park Nung-hoo told us in June, Korea is employing advanced information and communication technologies through the infection disease prevention and control process, including tracing and the operation of quarantine and isolation, and that is of value in overcoming the relative lack of administrative staff in the process. Third, and more importantly, in the context, increased cooperation between Europe and Korea is not only more likely, but also to be wished for. In the issue-based coalition I mentioned earlier, it is essential to complement the traditional 3Ds, defense, diplomacy, and development, with what I call the additional 3Ts, trade, technology, and thought. Regarding China, there is no blissful optimism from Europe. There is either a careful optimism or a careful pessimism. As President Macron underlined in March 2019, Europe is not naive anymore and key is to work on a united position. Once again, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a catalyst and an eye-opener on the need to adopt a more united, but also a more cooperative approach. Indeed, outside of the US-China confrontation, what I call the rest of us represents 60% of the world GDP, 80% of the world export, 98% of the votes at the United Nations General Assembly. The rest of the world needs to offer a positive agenda with concrete recommendations. And I will conclude in making 4 concrete recommendations. First, we need to deepen existing track 1, track 1.5, and track 2 dialogue to learn from our mutual experience, from learning best practices in managing the COVID-19 pandemic to dealing with a more assertive China that is using its economic leverages to political ends. As such, Korea's experience is key, including in the wake of Chinese sanctions following the THAAD deployment, and discussing the resilience of supply chains and the so-called trade shields to mitigate economic pressure. Second, we need to strengthen our focus on the promotion of multilateralism in and outside international organizations, including with democracies, big or small. A renewed support to the Alliance for Multilateralism, initiated by France and Germany, is key, as well as supporting initiatives with third parties, including in Southeast Asia and Africa. It also means promoting key concepts, such as the concept of human security, a UN-embraced concept that President Moon highlighted in his May 10th special address. Third, we need to honor and expand the EU-South Korea Framework Agreement we celebrate the 10th anniversary this year. That included a wide range of international concerns, including non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, human rights, cooperation in the fight against terrorism, energy security, climate change, and development assistance. Koreans should be more associated to key EU policy projects, such as the EU Consortium on Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the EU P2P Program on Export Control, or even the Mind Before Act Program against violent extremism. Fourth, and not least, we need to strengthen our mutual technological sovereignty while increasing scientific cooperation to promote global norms and standards. Areas are already designated officially in the bilateral cooperation, such as nanosafety, automated driving system, polar research, etc. It is essential to go further and expand the agreement on the scientific and technological cooperation we already have. It's also important to better coordinate within international organizations, such as the International Organization for Standardization and the International Electrotechnical Commission. If neither the EU nor Korea want to be forced to choose between the US and China, the only way we have is to offer an alternative to the international community and to be more proactive in our international dealings rather than reactive. And as such, EU-Korea cooperation will be key. Thank you very much.
Merci, Dr. Bondaz. I am happy now to introduce next panelist, Dr. Nicola Casarini, Senior Fellow of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, Roma. Dr. Nicola Casarini, you are going to deal with the EU-Korea strategic partnership 10 years after, opportunities and challenges in the age of COVID and mounting US-China tensions. Question to you, Dr. Casarini, if I may. Could you please elaborate on some areas of cooperation between the EU and South Korea within this pandemic crisis and in the middle of exacerbated tensions between US and China? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me thank, first of all, the Asia Center, Jean-François Meglio, and the Asia Center team for this opportunity to join you in this very important and, as already said, timely discussion. My presentation will focus on precisely what you asked me on two cooperation areas. So the first one will be on health issues, in particular medical supplies. And the second one on how Europe and Korea are addressing the disruption of global supply chains and hence also the mounting US-China tensions. And of course, what we have here is a very well-established partnership. As the MAP from Austria already said in the introduction, we are facing here like a cooperation between Europe and Korea, which is well-established, which also creates the basis for future cooperation in areas which will become more and more important in the next years. And these areas that I have outlined in my paper are, first of all, health issues. So we have, like, since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, the problem of not only the pandemic, but also related to the medical supplies because of the over-reliance on some suppliers, including, and most importantly, China. So in this context, we have witnessed the Europeans and the Koreans agreeing on cooperation on two levels. One, information sharing. And this is very important because we have a fairly successful South Korean example on how to tackle the coronavirus pandemic without having to impose strict lockdowns. They have been quite successful in reining in the pandemic. And on the other hand, we have the European case. In Europe, we had a certain lack of coordination, not to say that a complete lack of coordination at EU level, at least in March, April, and each country adopted its own strategy. But here we have like a model which emerged in discussions between the Europeans and the Koreans, which is the German model, which is in between the model which has been adopted by Southern Europe, my country, Italy, but also France, Spain, strict lockdowns, and quite opposite to the model adopted by Northern Europe, not to mention Sweden, which has never closed the country, never went for a lockdown. So we have the German model, the German approach to the coronavirus pandemic, which has been adopted as a kind of like a model in discussion between the European Union and South Korea when sharing information on the pandemic. So information sharing is very important because they are like-minded countries, democracies, human rights, and rule of law dominate in South Korea, in Europe, and we have indeed witnessed in the last months a certain danger to some of the liberties that we have been used to enjoy because of the coronavirus pandemic. So very important, the information sharing. Alongside information sharing, it has also been cooperation, initial cooperation in trading medical devices, medical supplies. And this has been done or proposed on three levels. So let me just flesh out some of the ideas that have been proposed, in particular by South Korean experts. The first would be at the bilateral level between Europe and Korea, a so-called medical equipment swap lines, something akin to central bank swap lines, whereby the two sides can swap medical equipment and hence reduce over-reliance on suppliers like China. And this can be done both at the bilateral level, but also at the regional level, with the intervention, in this case, in the case of Northeast Asia, of the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat. Trilateral cooperation is cooperation among Japan, China, and South Korea. And traditionally, the European Union has supported this form of cooperation. So again, here we have the possibility for the two sides to cooperate at the regional level, and also multilateral level in international fora, including the World Health Organization, and of course the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Also because, and this is the second part, and I'm going to conclude afterwards of my presentation, we don't only have the health issues, but also the socioeconomic implications of the global pandemic-induced recession. And here again, we have similar approaches undertaken by the European Union and South Korea. The problem of global supply chains is also related to the problem of onshoring, reducing reliance on China, and also tackle the US-China mounting tensions, which are forcing both the Europeans and the South Koreans to take side. Now, in my paper, you will find more details, but let me just say the following. We have witnessed similar approaches undertaken by the European Union and Korea on these issues, and also the difficulties that both Europe and Korea have in reducing reliance on China. In fact, in my paper, you will find data on the difficulties by South Korean companies and also European companies in trying to find other export markets than China, or in trying to move the manufacturing base away from China. It is a common problem which is pushing the two sides, the two partners, South Korea and the European Union, in trying to find a compromise, a modus operandi between the United States and China. In the trade and technological war between the United States and China, both the European Union and South Korea cannot choose a side. They cannot choose a side for different reasons, political reasons, but also economic reasons. It is very difficult for companies to reduce reliance on China, which means that, and this is my conclusion, we are witnessing both the European Union and South Korea trying to come up with some ways in order to stay good allies with the United States, but at the same time not to create problems with China, which remains a very important economic partner, especially an essential export market for South Korea, but also for the European Union. In the EU, we have this idea of strategic autonomy, which is being developed, which could help us in navigating between the United States and China. In the case of South Korea, we have this strategic ambiguity concept, which has been elaborated in order to explain the possibility for South Korea to stay in good terms with the United States, which remains a close ally, but at the same time, without creating problems with the important Chinese market. In the end, I would expect the Biden presidency, if it is officially announced at a certain point, not to change that much in this trend. We will have in the future South Korea and the EU, and this is my provision, my forecast, they will continue to try to navigate this US-China relationship, even if the Biden presidency will allow them more room for maneuvering than a Trump administration, which has really imposed allies to choose a side. But having said that, I think that for the future of the partnership, we will have more and more cooperation between the European Union and South Korea, and more efforts are trying to seek to find their own way in this context of not only characterized by the global pandemic, but also US-China tensions that will indeed continue even with the Biden presidency. Thank you.
Thank you. Grazie, Dr. Casarini. And now I would like to pass to Monsieur Paul André. Paul André is adjunct faculty, Collège Universitaire, SciencesPo, Associate Research Fellow, EU-Asia Institute, SK. Is Korea on the threshold of the G7, a public choice approach, strategic opportunities and challenges ahead in the perspective of enlarged G7? My question to you, Monsieur Paul André, is on May last, 31st, former US President Donald Trump unexpectedly announced his willingness to invite South Korea, as well as Australia, India, and Russia, to the next G7 meeting. Professor André, does it make sense for G7 members to include new members, such as South Korea? What could be the opportunities for South Korea to be part of the G7? And do you think the Biden elected as a new president of the US is still option still on the table? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Debussy. I would like first to express my greatest gratitude for the invitation of the Asia Center and the amazing job performed to the organization of this symposium. Actually, this is a very important question because, as you mentioned, the Trump administration very unexpectedly announced its willingness to invite South Korea, but also Australia and India to the next G7 summit. And one question at first sight would be, does it make sense actually from the South Korean point of view to seize this opportunity, or is it, if I would say, kind of a risky bet? The other aspect is also, does it make sense for the other G7 members to be very enthusiastic about this initiative? I would like first to express my very modesty on this perspective, considering that Mr. Debussy has an insider expertise in the preparation of such summits. So I will just limit my presentation to the theory of international relations and economics. But this invitation actually could make sense in a way, but it could be also, as I said, quite a risky bet. If we go back to the context, indeed, and I would like here to resume an idea shared by Antoine Bondaz earlier, is that I think that this invitation could be seen as, well, another unexpected and not necessarily meaning in the long run initiative by the Trump administration, but it can be also seen as a catalysis on ongoing trends, deeper trends about rising cooperation between the EU and South Korea. So the idea of the G7 is that it can be seen as a club. So this club has the ability to influence global economic affairs. And so being part of the club is very powerful lever to any of the member. But matter of fact, actually, if a country is added to this club, that will reduce the relative influence of other club members. So from a pure strategic point of view, indeed, all G7 members should be very careful about adding a new member to the G7. Having said that, it does not mean that cooperation and adding additional members indeed is impossible. Let me just remind that South Korea is already part for 2 decades now of the G20. And it's not completely a nonsense, I shall say, considering that South Korea is a leading country in the 4th industrial revolution. It's a leading country in the current trends in the evolution of the global economy. And it's one of the most important economy of Asia Pacific. And considering the shift of power in the global economy, the presence of South Korea indeed made sense. But as I've said, indeed, from the pure strategic point of view, it's not necessarily obvious that other G7 countries would accept this. So in a nutshell, I would say, indeed, Korea had not to be too enthusiastic about Trump initiative in May, because the point for South Korea was not to be part of an anti-China coalition. South Korea has to be very careful about this. And the question is nowadays, what does the Biden election changes? As President Moon just reminded, South Korea is very careful about having no vacuum in the relation between Korea and America. And I think it's also true for economic governance. What the election changes is probably that there will have more cooperation. And so that reinforces this idea of strategic opportunities for Korea. So I would say from a pure strategic opportunity, from the Korean point of view, that creates indeed what it would be important from the South Korean perspective would be to have kind of a ratchet effect as a form of naturalization in the idea that South Korea is a key player in the international economic governance. But from the European point of view, indeed, cooperation with South Korea is also indeed an asset. Korea has the European countries have been quite locked in this battle between giants, between China and the US. So there is indeed a convergence of interest. There is a convergence also in terms of perspectives. And I would go a little further also in terms of the structure of capitalism. Facing a very assertive state capitalism in China and its export, I would say, through a certain number of international organizations, indeed, European countries and South Korea share this idea of not having a state capitalism. And so that is also a common point that can foster deeper cooperation. So I will just conclude in a nutshell to stick to the 7 minutes. I would say that from the Korean point of view, indeed, the key element is not to appear to be in a frontal open opposition to China, considering the high level of economic interdependence. But at the same time, it is a great opportunity for South Korea to be part of this influential club that the G7 is. Probably that this invitation reveals an ongoing trend which is deeper than just an initiative taken by the previous administration. And this effect should be a kind of naturalization of South Korea as a leading actor in the international global governance of the economy. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, professeur André. Et je voudrais maintenant passer la parole à Jean-François Di Meglio, qui est l'organisateur de cette conférence, président de Asia Centre. The European Union restricted measures against North Korea, a medium-term view beyond the current difficulties, looking at solutions between the deadlock. A question to you, Jean-François. What is the state of play of European sanctions against North Korea? And is it still a useful tool? Is the EU a meaningful actor regarding the Korean Peninsula's situation? And what are the future stances of EU countries and EU institutions vis-à-vis North Korea beyond the sanctions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, André, and thank you for supporting this panel and helping with the organization as well. Of course, as a panelist, I would not thank Asia Center, but as the chair of Asia Center, I want to express my very, very deep thanks to my young associates, Clément Durif and Maël, who really coordinated the organization, and without whom this would not be possible. They have achieved a tremendous job, and I think we should all thank them as speakers at least, and I hope the participants as well. I also have to thank the various French and European diplomats who helped me, together with Mr. René Consolot, putting up this paper about the role that the European Union can play in the various aspects of the situation in the Korean Peninsula. We have now a very specific situation as we speak, and as this webinar takes place, because we had the US election last week, and we can still say that the US election is ongoing. And the role of the US has been key during the last 3-4 years. What will be the role of the US in the coming 3-4 years? We don't know yet. We can say now that, of course, without some of the US action, the current situation whereby the direst threats from North Korea have been momentarily halted, yet the threats are still around, and European Union's role, as far as European Union may look from the Korean Peninsula, can be key not only in the months to come, but also in the years to come, to help define a Western position vis-à-vis the Korean Peninsula situation. Of course, we have to remember that most of the European Union members have diplomatic relations with North Korea. That does not mean, of course, that they are friends to North Korea. Only 2 members of the European Union, Estonia and France, do not enjoy diplomatic relations with North Korea. North Korea has a diplomatic representation vis-à-vis the European Union. We may call it a funny situation because this representation is now based in London. So we shall have to see what happens. But I will speak later on about the current situation of the representatives of the various European Union countries in Pyongyang, or no longer in Pyongyang for that matter, and as a start with the representative from the UK, which has left Pyongyang. European Union is part of United Nations, of course, and the sanctions against North Korea, as the papers show, were first taken in 2006 after 15 years of attempts from UN and from European Union to cooperate with North Korea. The sanctions from European Union are aligned with the sanctions by United Nations, and after the first 2 resolutions by United Nations, European Union also took their own resolutions against North Korea, and the sanctions have been renewed and are still kept on under the chairmanship currently of Germany. It's quite interesting to mention that on top of the situation which prevails between various Western countries and the Korean situation, of course, the European Union has this very, very specific item in its history, because one of the members of the European Union has gone through a situation which is now the same as the Korean Peninsula, without saying, of course, that the outcome should be the same in the future for the Korean Peninsula as it has been for Germany. But it's quite interesting to see that Germany is chairing the committee looking after the sanctions. So currently, what have the sanctions achieved. Of course, the sanctions have harmed the North Korean situation, the North Korean economy. They have harmed the attempt by North Korea to do barter trade with some countries. They have also attempted, and they managed to have maybe a softer approach by North Korea, a weaker North Korea. And in that matter, of course, the European sanctions have complemented the United Nations one. They show that not only do we have United Nations implementing sanctions against North Korea, but also there is an additional and a focused approach by the European Union. So a kind of double watch on what North Korea can achieve. The latest developments in the frame of the coronavirus crisis have been that, of course, the situation has been worsening in terms of the representations of European diplomats in North Korea, and they have left basically after an episode whereby they have been quarantined and then prevented from coming back on the basis of the request by the various European countries to, one, have their diplomats enjoying a normal situation dealing with the North Korean authorities, have the European citizens enjoying a certain degree of safety and protection in North Korea, and failing guarantees presented by North Korea to European countries, of course, there is a deadlock situation currently. What can be the outcome of the current situation? Of course, European Union is willing to help in the process. Within the remaining countries in the 27 members of European Union, France is the one able to speak as a nuclear power in the frame of discussions around the nuclear situation in the Korean Peninsula. And of course, without direct involvement because of its geographical situation, because it's very peculiar situation in terms of alliances, European Union is very willing to be a helpful partner in the negotiations. European Union, of course, has a very high degree of awareness of the importance of South Korea in the diplomatic dialogue worldwide, and can be a leverage for South Korea to help, whereby South Korea at some point of time was feeling left aside in the direct North Korea-US discussions throughout 2019. This is why in this very important crisis in the world safety situation, in this very important moment where we are, at the moment where we will have a new US presidency, EU is probably willing to raise its profile in the Korean situation and has many elements whereby it can help make progress in this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-François. Merci. And there will be a transition between the two panels. This transition will be conducted by Elisabeth Suh, hello, visiting a fellow at SWP Berlin. Certain uncertainty, the cyber challenge posed by Pyongyang. Question to you, Mrs. Suh, as your paper is dealing with the cyber challenge posed by Pyongyang, could you please elaborate more on the cyber threats coming from Pyongyang and on the potential areas of cooperation between EU and South Korea within cyberspace? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you so much to the team at the Asia Center for organizing this event. I would very much like to share my screen if this is possible. I prepared some slides to really show what the cyber threat is posed by North Korea. If that is not possible, I have to just explain to you this way. So the cyber threat is something that is a growing challenge posed by North Korea. Thank you very much. First off, if we can move to the second slide already, it is clear that the cyber challenge is something very much growing, as I said. Since over the last decade, the DPRK's operation have increased in quantity and quality, and they have improved in technical sophistication and global reach, harming targets in the private and public sector. And these three examples that I outlined here, for example, the DPRK was behind denial of service attacks in 2009 that paralyzed ROK and US government websites. And by 2013, the DPRK was able to infiltrate television stations and banks in the ROK with malware, deleting over 30,000 hard disks. And Pyongyang was also behind the WannaCry incident in 2017. You might have heard of this. WannaCry targeted more than 200,000 computers in 150 countries, encrypting data and demanding ransom payments in cryptocurrency for de-encryption, and resulting in damages ranging in the hundreds of millions US dollars. The next slide, please. These three examples also outline the major tools and techniques that the DPRK is using. And this list is by far not exhaustive, but shows some examples of known and common tools that the DPRK is using for entry and operation. I would just like to highlight a few things here. For example, that cryptocurrencies have provided the DPRK with additional tools as well as targets for its criminal activities in cyberspace. And I tend to focus more on the economic, political, and military consequences of the DPRK's cyber operations. And while immediate financial gain is probably one of the major interests of the DPRK, I believe also gathering critical information, disrupting economic and political processes, and sabotaging communication systems is also in the interest of the DPRK. And this list of purposes also explains the diverse list of actual and potential targets of cyber operations. And one overarching strategic objective that I see is that cyber operations simply expand the list of challenges posed by the DPRK and thereby add another issue to the bargaining table vis-a-vis the ROK or US. And that digital technologies also help in projecting power and an image of modernity. The next slide shows the strategic calculus of the DPRK that I believe exists. And it's very clear that operations in cyberspace have a very beneficial cost-benefit ratio for the DPRK. So I actually once heard the phrase that digital technologies have the potential to be mass weapons of destruction, since knowledge and software are not very limited in their availability. Also, operations in cyberspace carry little operational risks, since attribution remains a very big difficulty. And another major advantage of cyber operations is that they provide for great synergy effects. So, for example, attacks on economic targets can result in political instability, intelligence gathering, and simply practicing disruption in peacetime can also be used in wartime. And also, the DPRK appears to be at an asymmetric advantage, as I would call it, since pretty much all of its potential targets across the world are highly interconnected. They are dependent on the internet, whereas the DPRK is pretty shut off from the global digital infrastructure. I am thus quite certain that operations will not only continue, but also continue to increase in quantity, reach, and technical sophistication. And it was already reported that during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, cyber operations have increased in quantity at least. The next slide is my final slide, and maybe the most important, since there are really crucial areas for cooperation between the EU and the ROK. And here I would just like to highlight 3 main areas for cooperation. And I would also like to emphasize that the first 2 areas, especially the first 2 areas here, necessitate also engagement of the private sector in the ROK and in the European Union, respectively. So cybersecurity is at the top of the agenda. It includes regular education and training of personnel, as well as continuous protection of digital communication and information structures by, for example, investing in technical solutions to fix known vulnerabilities and constantly updating software. Additionally, I believe that foresight of potential targets and vulnerabilities is key. And there are really a number of different technical ways, such as authorized hacking, to check for vulnerabilities and unintended consequences. Secondly, the second area, investing in means to improve attribution and tracing capabilities is essential to increase the level of knowledge about cyber operations. And this knowledge about actors and techniques needs to be shared between partners such as the EU and the ROK. And sharing this intelligence also will help to improve the diplomatic and economic statecraft to curb cyber operations. So the third area now. This includes sanctions imposition, as well as other means to build, strengthen, and utilize a normative framework for cyberspace. And fortunately, the EU and ROK are already engaging in this, for example, in their regular cyber dialogue that they're holding since 2015. Last but certainly not least, the EU and ROK also need to engage third parties. And by this, I mean states that are likely hosting groups operating on the DPRK's behalf or otherwise supporting such cyber operations. And I guess it would be helpful here to clarify that the DPRK cyber operations don't abide by any political or technical limits. For example, it was reported that recent hackings of Chinese government institutions and Russian defense industry can be attributed to groups operating on the DPRK's behalf. And with this, I thank you for your attention and return back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Suh. And we pass now on to the second panel.
Thank you very much to the first panelists. Thank you, André, for chairing this first panel. As the chair of the second panel, I'm very happy to be back on stage in my second role, and of course, to welcome all the speakers. The second panel has been called Future Opportunities for European Union and Korea Cooperation in Specific Areas of Competency and Excellence. I'm happy to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo from King's College. And Dr. Pacheco Pardo is also running the University of Vrije Korea Center. Dr. Pacheco Pardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate at this session today and to write a paper on the EU-ROK FTA. So during my 6-7 minutes, I'm going to summarize the key points from the paper, which I think covers what we could consider the most developed relationship between the EU and South Korea, the free trade agreement between both of them, signed 10 years ago, provisionally applied since July 2011, and that has served to boost economic relations to unprecedented levels, both in the area of trade, and also it has supported greater investment in both directions. So I would like to make 3 key points. The first point is that the bilateral trade agreement between the EU and the ROK, it is not only a bilateral affair, but it is also a multilateral affair. It has supported for both of them, for the EU and for South Korea, greater engagement in the other part of the world. In the case of the European Union, greater engagement in Asia, and particularly in East Asia. In the case of South Korea, greater engagement with the European Union and diversification away from other partners, especially the US. And I'll get back to this point later on. And I also want to point out that this free trade agreement shows the long-term thinking on both sides, because when it was signed on the part of the European Union, it was part of the Global Europe Trade Strategy that was launched in 2006. And in fact, it was the first FTA signed under this strategy. And obviously, the European Union continues to support multilateral trade, but also bilateral FTAs as a way to strengthen its economic relations and political relations with other parts of the world. In the case of South Korea, the FTA was signed as part of the FTA roadmap that was announced already in September 2003 by the Im Donghyun administration, and that has carried on ever since and continues to these days. So when the FTA was signed, what were the goals that both parties wanted to achieve? There were a couple of goals that were common to both of them, to the European Union and South Korea, that I guess are very basic. The first one was to boost bilateral trade between the two signatories to the FTA. And the second one was to diversify trade partners. In the case of the European Union, this was, of course, the FTA with an Asian country, but it was also the first new generation FTA. And therefore, it has served as the template for future FTAs with other countries in East Asia. For example, the recent one with Japan, previous ones with Singapore or Vietnam. But it has also served as a template for new generation FTAs with other parts of the world, for example, with Canada. And in the case of South Korea, this diversification came at a point in time when, of course, South Korea was negotiating a bilateral FTA with the US, KORUS, the famous KORUS between the US and South Korea. So the negotiations first started between the US and South Korea. Then they started between the European Union and South Korea, but the EU-Korea FTA was signed first and has been implemented for a longer period of time than the KORUS FTA. But for South Korea was a way to diversify from what some saw as a strong dependence on economic links, not only political links, but economic links with the US. And for South Korea, of course, it was also part of the strategy of getting FTAs signed with the big three of the European Union, the US, and China. And South Korea now has the FTAs with the three of them. If we move beyond the narrower economic goals, we see that for the European Union, the FTA with South Korea came at a point in time when it was trying to increase its presence in Asia. And of course, a couple of years ago, we saw this security strategy in and with Asia that was approved by the European Union. Now, this security strategy, of course, its roots date back decades, but this security strategy has been supported by the bilateral FTAs that the European Union has signed with counterparts in East Asia. So let's take the case of South Korea. In the case of South Korea, partly thanks to the FTA, today the European Union and South Korea have over 35 bilateral dialogues and over 35 bilateral processes in which they discuss all sorts of matters. More or less half of these dialogues are purely about economic matters, FTA-related matters, but then you have other dialogues on security matters, and you also have dialogues on political issues. So you see how for the European Union, the bilateral FTA with South Korea, serve to boost this network of bilateral dialogues that have later on supported greater relations with South Korea and with the rest of East Asia and the whole Asian continent beyond economics. One last point to note in the last couple of minutes that I have time for is that now we have to look at the future. I'm not going to talk about the new administration in the US. I will only say that we can expect this administration to support multilateralism in a way that the Trump administration hasn't done. And of course, this is beneficial for the European Union and South Korea because both of them support multilateralism. What I want to focus on is on a specific cooperation between the EU and South Korea in a post-COVID environment. We know that the COVID pandemic has had a strong and negative effect on the world economy, and we have seen how the European Union has announced a European Green Deal and South Korea has announced a Green New Deal as a way to recover from the crisis. Well, here there is an obvious area for cooperation. And I go back to the previous point. Thanks in part to the bilateral FTA, the EU and South Korea have a bilateral dialogue process discussing these sort of matters, green growth, climate change, etc., etc. So you see the nexus between the EU-South Korea FTA and the future relationship between both countries. Another aspect that I want to focus on is the so-called reform of the WTO. Well, obviously, the bilateral FTA between the EU and South Korea underpins cooperation and discussions between both of them on trade matters. And finally, so I don't go over time, we should expect the EU and South Korea to continue to cooperate through the World Health Organization, but also to continue what they have started recently, which is bilateral cooperation in learning on how to deal with pandemics. Obviously, the South Korean response to the pandemic has been very good, along with other East Asian countries, such as Taiwan and Japan. And in the case of the European Union, we're in the middle of the second wave, and we need to see how to prevent a third wave, not only how to solve the second wave. So this is an area for cooperation in which, as I said, there have already been incipient links, but that should continue to strengthen over the next few months. So I will leave it there and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ramon. I know that you also have some duties. I don't know whether you comply with them already or not, but we will be happy to keep you on board when the questions come in.
Yeah, I did. I came back now. I'm okay now. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks. And now I'm happy to welcome Dr. Tereza Novotna. Dr. Tereza Novotna is from Maria Sklodowska School within
yes, Free University of Berlin, Maria Sklodowska-Curie.
Thank you, and you will speak about EU-Korea partnership within the US-China conflict, which is a key topic nowadays. Thank you very much, Dr. Novotna.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction and primarily for having me on this really great project, which is very timely and very important, both for Europe and Asia, and especially Korea. So I'll start my 7 minutes by a quote from Josep Borrell, the High Representative for EU Foreign Policy and Vice President of the Commission, who was talking about COVID-19 as the great accelerator of history. He emphasized that the pandemics has strengthened trends that were already present before, that the pandemics has increased rivalries, especially between the US and China, and that there is a increased pressure for the EU to choose sides. And that's why the EU must invest more in working with other countries in Asia, such as South Korea, Japan, and India. And this is exactly the starting point for me to say that it's both the EU and South Korea that are sort of squeezed between the United States and China. And my paper is looking at sort of the broader situation, how this looks, and of course at steps that that both the EU and China, South Korea can take. And also to emphasize that it's not just a result of the corona pandemics, but that this sort of US-China rivalry is a result of longer-term trends. In terms of what the EU and South Korea can do, I look at 3 issues, or I argue 3 points. First of all, that the 2 partners should strengthen their strategic partnership. And I look at 5 areas: health, trade, digitalization, climate, and multilateralism. So that's one point, to strengthen the partnership. But the second point, which perhaps hasn't been addressed yet throughout both panels we had, is that the 2 partners, EU and ROK, should sort of look for areas where they can sort of preempt or prevent the US-China tensions from escalating. And in those areas to look how these 2 partners could sort of deal with those areas, how to come up with joint proposals. And the third suggestion I have is that the EU and ROK should create a network of like-minded partners, especially in Southeast Asia, so with ASEAN countries and Asia Pacific, so countries like New Zealand and Australia, and basically to look which of these countries would be willing to team up with EU and South Korea rather than to choose sides between the US and China. So I'll sort of pick and choose some points, and I will see how I can go about them. Antoine Bondaz had a very nice presentation about the sort of increased China's rhetorics and aggressive diplomacy. Maybe one comment I would have is I find interesting that now in the second Europe wave of COVID-19, China doesn't seem to be very active. So, you know, the question is it because Europe has managed to get enough PPE and sort of doesn't need China, or is it because China actually realized that the first sort of very aggressive stance was rather counterproductive, which we could see in different polls. For example, a Pew poll, which asked Europeans and South Koreans how they see the management of the pandemics by China and the US, and Europeans appreciated Chinese leadership only by 40%, while South Koreans only 20%. Although that, of course, is sort of still good in comparison to how the Europeans look at the US leadership in the pandemics, which was criticized by 84% of the Europeans and 93% of the South Koreans. So obviously the US is not doing much better, but nevertheless, China hasn't improved its standing in Europe much at all. So I'll just give 2 quick examples where both the Europeans and South Koreans could get caught into the US-China rivalry without basically wanting to do that. The first example is the visit by head of the Czech Senate to Taiwan, which took place in late August, early September this year. And luckily or not, it coincided with a trip of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi around Europe. And the trip was at that time supposed to sort of mend the ties between Europe and China. And it quite clearly failed because Wang Yi at that time basically criticized the Czech Senate's chair trip to Taiwan, and said, you know, the Czech Republic and the politician will pay a heavy price, which caused uproar not only inside of the Czech Republic, but also among European leaders. Both French and German foreign ministers really supported the Czech politicians. And the other example I would say is the example of the 70th anniversary of the breakout of the Korean War, where in the Chinese sort of perspective, it has been portrayed as sort of the war against the US aggression, without actually mentioning the fact that it was North Korea first, which sort of invaded the South. And the person who got caught up in this sort of US-China conflict was one of the leading members of BTS, very popular South Korean K-pop group, who, when he was receiving a prize for BTS, was accused of hurting Chinese feelings because he didn't mention the Chinese sacrifices of the Chinese volunteer army. Of course, the problem for the South Korean singer was that the Chinese fought on the other side, North Korean side. So in a way, you can see that even sort of popular band can get caught up in these tensions. So just to quickly say, I don't want to repeat what has been already said about, what the EU and South Korea can do about the pandemics. Just maybe to say that, in my view, China and South Korea represent two ways how to deal with the pandemics. The South Korean way is to focus on mass testing, while the Chinese way is to focus on mass lockdowns, and the Europeans were sort of moving between the two poles. We've heard a lot about FTA, so I don't want to go into that, but maybe just the last point about the role of North Korea. Jean-François talked a lot about sanctions. I would maybe emphasize a slightly different approach, and that's how the EU and South Korea can involve North Korea in international negotiations. And one of the options looking at the pandemics would be to involve North Korea in the Gavi's COVAX facility, which is the one which will provide vaccination once it's available to low-income countries. DPRK is a member or is eligible for this support, and in a way to get it involved in this vaccination scheme would be a good way how to integrate North Korea into international and multilateral system through which DPRK could also benefit. So just my last point that I wanted to emphasize was that instead of sort of trying to choose sides between the US and China, EU and South Korea should sort of look for their own way. And one of the ways in which they could do it is to also team up with the countries in ASEAN, in Asia Pacific, and that would also be a good way how to revive multilateralism in general, not just the partnership between the EU and ROK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tereza. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I will now leave the floor to Cligandel Institute, should I say. I'm saying Cligandel Institute because Cligandel Institute is now represented by Brigitte Decker, who one of the co-authors of the next paper on European Union and Korea digital connectivity and the efforts that Korea and the European Union can make together against what the authors call China's techno-nationalism, which is at the core of the various topics that we are tackling now. In this second panel, the last topic will be very closely related to soft power as well, which is not that much disconnected from the digital and China's influence, which will be tackled by Brigitte Decker now in her presentation. Brigitte, the floor is yours. I thank all the speakers so far for having respected the time limit. We are almost right on time, and I would really wish that we keep about at least 20 minutes for the Q&A session. We do have questions, and I would regret if they are not answered. So Brigitte and Rafal, who is the very last speaker, please keep your presentation very, very close to 7 minutes. Brigitte, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I will try to keep it short. So first of all, good morning to everyone watching online. As said, together with my colleague Michael Kano-Heijmans, I wrote a paper about the opportunities for the EU-Korea relation in the field of digital connectivity. And in this presentation, I will just highlight the key findings of our paper. Maybe it's good to start with the term digital connectivity. It is a field we work in quite often, but is not yet well known among many. So we see digital connectivity as all digital efforts undertaken by countries in regulation, business, and infrastructure. This means it's the EU GDPR, the data protection regulation, but also the new 5G infrastructure discussion is included in this field. And in the EU, digital connectivity comes forward in the connectivity strategy and the EU's digitalization strategy. Both of those strategies offer the EU's human-centered perspective on technology. And our paper has been written against the backdrop of China's new plan, China Standards 2035. While the official text is not yet public, it is expected to be a blueprint to write global standards for the next generation of technology. It is mainly focuses on the regulation side, but is also included in the infrastructure and business side of digital connectivity, as the regulation will determine which standards companies will use in the future. The Chinese standards most likely counter the EU's effort, as that China is tending to have a techno-nationalist view, while the EU's focus is specifically on privacy and open, transparent internet. But interestingly, the Chinese standards also most likely counter the US business-focused perspective, in which minimal regulation is preferred. So it's really like a threefold discussion. And responding to a real need, the Chinese standards are expected to be exported to developing countries through the Digital Silk Road. This is the digital subject of the Belt and Road Initiative and helps countries with online alternatives. And especially the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the Digital Silk Road's influence. But no real alternatives from the EU or other like-minded countries are yet presented in those countries, giving a specific need for the EU to focus on this area. And just as the EU, now coming to the Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea is a really like-minded country in this respect, also valuing privacy and a human-centered approach. And in order to create more global leverage, the EU and the Republic of Korea can increase that digital cooperation and push that thoughts forward. So coming to what we discuss in our paper, we see three potential specific avenues for further cooperation. In the field of data regulation, the commercialization of innovation, and the digital official development assistance. First, in the field of data regulation and data sharing. The EU and the Republic of Korea are discussing the adequacy status of Korea at the moment. These discussions have been going on for quite some time, especially since some regulation had to be changed in the Republic of Korea. And the adequacy status is a part of a framework for countries that have similar levels of data protection as the EU, meaning that if they get adequacy status, their data can be handled as intra-EU data. Giving Korea this adequacy status will send a clear message on their like-mindedness concerning data regulation and their focus on consumer interest rather than business or state interest. And most of all, it will also benefit the economy, the digital economy, as it will be much easier to share their data with the EU, as no additional safeguards are necessary anymore. Secondly, so data regulation is quite ongoing, but we also see two other areas of cooperation in which some real efforts can be made yet. This is the commercialization of innovation. The EU and the ROK have a strong focus on academic research, but are now lacking in the translation of those ideas to startups. Many ideas are created, but once the idea is ready to get on the market, the business has not yet not enough financial means, and oftentimes this results in being bought by a US company or even forced out of the market before even entering it. And this is a shame, as many innovative ideas are created in either the EU or Korea. And in order to address this problem, we feel that the EU and Korea can step up their cooperation in this field. In Korea, for example, the Korea Advanced Institute for Science and Technology plays an important role as it manages funds to financially support startups that try to commercialize ideas created on this university. And I think that's a really great avenue for the EU to also explore, to really push the EU's ideas further. And by creating more university ties between the EU and Korea, and create joint financial stimulus to support startups together, may boost these efforts and help startups to gain ground on the digital market. Lastly, the EU and Korea can help each other in the field of digital official development assistance. In short, this consists of technical assistance by strategic and practical outreach in regulation, business, and digital infrastructure initiatives. As I said, China is really, through its digital Silk Road, involved in developing countries and their assistance in these technicalities. And this is a real need there. And in the last ROK EU policy consultation on development cooperation, digital ODA was not yet discussed. So therefore, increased attention to this subject might lead to new projects being undertaken by the EU and Korea, especially now the world focuses even more on digital means due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So looking at the time, I'm just under 7 minutes, so I think I will stop here now. But I'm happy to answer any remaining questions, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Brigitte. We have to keep it right in time. And now I give the floor to Rafał Spoczynski from the Polish Academy of Sciences. We are very happy to have you as the last speaker. And you will speak about the status of Korean soft power vis-à-vis Europe. Thank you very much, Rafał.
Hello, everyone. I will speak on behalf of Rafał Spoczynski and myself. My name is Eric. I represent Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and I will talk about public diplomacy and soft power of Korea in the EU. Before going into detail, I would like to highlight that we all know that Korea and EU have very positive relations, but public diplomacy, what both parties are quite latecomers in using this instrument. However, South Korea is using it in a quite advanced way, and so far it made one of the main foreign affairs instruments. Korean cultural diplomacy stimulated an influx of interest to all Korea-related phenomenon, including pop culture, music, entertainment, and now we have K-quarantine, the way of tackling COVID. This policy benefited with improvement of awareness, increase, betterment of national image abroad, and increase of sales Korean products, for example. However, worth noting that Korean government, when it is directing the Korean wave, is taking either region or country-specific approach. If we speak about Europe as a continent, Korea mainly concerns and targets Germany, France, and UK public as the most prominent and interesting markets so far. Other countries receive smaller attention, and in the same time, Korea has some joint EU-oriented policies and vectors like Euro Access or European Gateway. You probably all know about it. And but still, the concentration is on bilateral relations. As for EU, it is actively trying to catch up with public diplomacy implementation, but still. It is lagging, and recent survey by European Commission that was launched like a few years ago showed that there is lack of awareness about the EU among Koreans. If we talk about the current status of Korean soft power and Korean public diplomacy in the EU, let's outline several things. First, despite having this big Korean wave around the world, for example, in Asia or the US, it is rather small in the EU. Last year, Korea made only $1.5 million, just almost nothing, from entertainment content selling. It is just a 0.5% from all the income from this area that Korea made last year. Second, Korean agencies dealing with country image survey typically focus on the UK, France, and Germany. Overall, the image of these three countries is positive, of Korea in these three countries is positive, but in the rest countries, it is basically unknown. And the same survey showed that while Asians, when they learn information about Korea, are mainly concerned about Korean music or pop stars or celebrities, the Europeans mainly are concerned about political news. No surprise, we have North Korea. So I would say that Korea was not yet able to win hearts and minds of Europeans, and Korean wave in Europe is not that strong. Also, it should be mentioned that the studies about Korean public diplomacy and Korean wave in Europe are very few. On positive aspects, could be mentioned that Korea does not have legal barriers that would prevent growth of Korean soft power in the Europe, so there is a room for growth. And finally, it is important to say that things are changing now, especially with the global success of Korean boys band that was previously mentioned, BTS, and the Parasite movie in the US. So maybe the impact of on the Europe will be delayed and will come through the US. So there are several recommendations and takeaways for both parties, the EU and Korea. First, as I mentioned, we need more rigorous research on how Korea is perceived in the EU and how Korean wave is spread in each country. Secondly, since the existing studies show lack of awareness between public of each country, the parties need more joint activities between Korea and the EU member states to decrease the negative image and increase a mutual understanding. For example, we faced a problem of a discriminatory attitude towards Asian in the EU and towards foreigners in the Korean Republic, spurred by COVID. Thirdly, Korea should be careful about improving Korean image by using its celebrities. They accidentally got in scandals, so it can impact the country image itself. So if they get in scandal, it is especially relevant for European countries because they are more concerned about political news and they might be more critical about the issues. Finally, there is a lot of ongoing cooperation between EU member states and Korea, but general public just does not know about it. Hence, Korea's image is stick to North Korean issue, which is usually reported with certain degree of fear and insecurity. So like it forms a stereotype that South Korea is a state nearby the quite fearful Kim Jong-un, who is going to attack somebody. So the increase of awareness about joint cooperation between each member state and Korea should improve the situation and break this stereotype. I think at this point I have everything. So if you have any questions, comments, complaints, please, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. At this juncture, I don't think we have any complaint, and your speech wraps up beautifully the various topics which were tackled in this webinar. We are now done with all the speakers and presenters, and once again, I thank them very sincerely and very deeply for their contribution, the written ones and the spoken ones. Time has been respected, and it's now up to us, the various participants who ask questions and the speakers who will have to answer, to keep up. We have 15 minutes. I would like it to keep it to maybe 12 to 13 minutes so that the very last announcement that I wish to make between, let's say, 2 minutes to 11 and 11 can be made. We will stay online after 11 o'clock for those participants who want to stay online, so that if there are still questions and people still listening to answers, we can keep on for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. But now Maël will bring up the questions that we received in writing and put them to the various speakers whom they are addressed to. So possibly we have time for 2 questions. For sure, we take the first very question. Maël.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your very interesting speeches. I'm going to do very quick. So we had a very interesting question from David Cameroux, researcher at CERI in SciencesPo. And this question is, what is the potential impact of Joe Biden's election on the triangular interplay between the EU, the 2 Koreas, and the US? I guess you are numerous to be able to answer this question. I don't know who wants to answer that one.
Of course, it's a tough choice, and my intention would be to put the answer to be given by possibly Nicola and Antoine. Nicola, can you take the burden of being the first one to answer?
Okay, thank you for the question. I also have another question that I saw on trilateral cooperation that I would like to address since it is contained in my paper, but we'll start with this question. As I mentioned towards the conclusion, I think that the Biden administration, if confirmed, will not change that much in the more general trend, which is the EU and South Korea in particular will have to find new ways to navigate US-China tensions. And this includes also the 2 Koreas and North Korea. I do believe that the European Union will have a role to play there, and we should actually not wait for the United States to do the first move. We have with the Biden administration an open window for multilateral initiatives, maybe resuming the 6-party talks in a different format with the European Union trying to trigger some kind of like momentum. And so that's why like this is positive, but at the same time, we should not rely too much at this point on the United States. I believe that Trumpism will remain. America first will remain also with Biden. So I think we should be ready. We should start getting ready mentally in Europe and South Korea to do things without the United States.
Antoine, would you like to complete this answer?
If I may, on cooperation between EU and Korea, I don't see that much change or that much impact from the Biden election. For sure, the trade dispute between the EU and US and Korea and US might be, I would say, less acute with the Biden administration. We might have a better way to coordinate and cooperate within international organization in creating de facto coalition, etc. But I'm not sure that the the Biden election is a key factor in the EU-Korea, South Korea relations. On EU-North Korea relation, on the opposite, I do believe there is a lot of margin to maneuver for the EU. The EU can be much more proactive. I wrote a paper earlier this year for the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium on that issue, and I do believe that the EU should not wait for the US to make a move or even wait for South Korea to make a move, and the EU should implement, I would say, an autonomous policy toward North Korea to re-engage North Korea and try as much as possible to defend an interest in at least 4 fields, let's say non-proliferation, the implementation of sanctions, political engagement, and indeed helping the North Korean people through something that we can do more with the South Koreans, including promoting the notion of human security, but also working on a disaster relief mechanism in North Korea with the EU and South Korea.
Thank you very much, Antoine. I am tempted also to turn to Dr. André, because the question is about global governance as well. And because Dr. André's presentation was about South Korea, Republic of Korea's role in a potential revamping of G7, possibly Dr. André would like to add something on this question.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much for this question, because that actually was a point I ended up mentioning, but within 7 minutes it was a bit difficult, so that I really appreciate this question. Well, the The point I think about the G7 is about the probably the difference between the G7 and the G20. One question which is at stake is the very purpose of the two clubs. Is the aim of the G7 the same as the G20? And if not, what would be the differences? Eventually, the question which is behind these clubs, so whether they are G7 or G20, is the future of international cooperation and the stage South Korea can have in this international cooperation. In a nutshell, because we are running out of time, I would say basically, indeed, international cooperation is not impossible, very fortunately. That's the good piece of news. But the framework is changing, and we are witnessing probably a new framework for international cooperation, especially in terms of international economic cooperation. As you know, South Korea is already part of the G20, as China is. And so I think that the club, the G20, is different, and its purpose is probably different. For South Korea to be considered as a specific member within the G20, it's something which is very important in terms of importance. And I agree with, for instance, what has been said in terms of soft power. Soft power is not only about culture, it's also about economic governance in terms of economic policies. And in these terms, indeed, mentioning South Korea as a putative member of the G8 or G9 is something which is important. The second point is that since China is also part of the G20, indeed, one fear is that the G20 turns to be locked because of this confrontation between the US and China. And eventually the question is about the very survival about international economic organizations. Since we are witnessing a change in the framework, eventually we have no guarantee that all international organizations will survive on the long run.
Thank you very much. We have another question which Meyer will put to Dr. Novotna, I believe.
Yeah, among the questions we gave her, we had one for Dr. Novotna. So in your article, you were mentioning the visit of the Czech delegation to Taiwan, which has provoked Chinese anger and threats. Do you think that a trilateral cooperation between Taiwan, South Korea, and the EU could be fostered in various fields, and maybe including other like-minded partners? What are the Asian actors who could associate with the EU to raise a voice regarding Taiwan's de facto independence? The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for the question. I must admit, I'm not an expert on Taiwan, but nevertheless, I think what the EU has been appreciating more and more is not just South Korea's success in dealing with the pandemics, but also other countries in Asia. And obviously Taiwan is also one of the good examples how to manage the pandemics. And also in terms of relationship with China, I mean, we've heard that the EU's stance is a bit hardening towards China. It's both a reaction to the Chinese politics, but also it's the EU's initiative. And one of the ways in which the EU could sort of also deal with the Chinese issue is to look at the ways in which it could work with Taiwan a little bit more. The Czech trip to Taiwan is a good one, a good example, because although it has created this sort of quite stark reaction by the Chinese foreign minister, the trip nevertheless was purely a business-oriented trip. So the Czech Speaker of the Senate has always emphasized that it doesn't undermine one China policy. So this is perhaps the way how the EU could also increase its collaboration with Taiwan, to say, okay, we can increase collaboration on in areas such as health, such as trade, which do not at the same time undermine one China policy. And South Korea could obviously be doing the same issue. So EU and South Korea could quite well collaborate on this issue, and obviously that would also strengthen the position of Taiwan, sort of from the global perspective. So that would be my thought.
Thank you very much, Dr. Novotna. I think we are very close to the end of our planned session, at least. I would like to say a few words of, I would say, initial conclusion. I'm saying initial conclusion because, of course, we can stay online if we wish, although that might be very difficult for the people who just have the sound and do not have access necessarily to voice, but they may want to ask written questions on the network, which will remain open for 10 to 15 minutes, and we will keep the questions open and possibly answer to them in writing or verbally for those speakers who can stay online. This is the option I leave to the speakers if they can stay online, but we should consider that by 11 o'clock Paris time, the session is officially closed for this time. I'm saying initially closed because there is a message that I would like to send to the participant and to the speakers and contributors. I think this experience of investigating the EU-ROK relation, the 10th anniversary of the FTA, has been a wonderful experience for researchers at Asia Center, but also the network, which has been constituted thanks to your help. I have to tell the participants that the writers, the contributors, the researchers have worked in a tremendous pace. The amount of time which was left to them was very short, much shorter than usual. On top of this, we had very difficult conditions, as we all know, because it was supposed to be a seminar in Brussels, and it ended up being a webinar. The webinar, technically speaking, worked wonderfully thanks to my assistance here, but also to everyone's contribution. Beyond this, I think there is, by large, room for establishing a network of researchers, but also people interested in academic investigation about ROK EU relations in the future. And more generally speaking, I think the implications of what I call the new arc of democracies, the new circle of democratic countries in Asia, sharing the same values as the European Union. We researchers, we think tankers, are probably able to write even more about the potential of those countries, which sometimes we call new countries, but are not much newer than I know we are, or they are. They are really old cultures, new democracies, very modern democracies, and we Europeans also have learned a lot from countries like Republic of Korea, for example. If the researchers agree, we will invite them to participate in this network, which starts with this webinar. Possibly we will have a second webinar because I think there is room for more debate, more papers. And once again, with these words, I would like to thank everyone for those 3 thrilling months of research, exchanges, writing, and organization in a very, very hectic environment. If we succeeded in such an environment, I think we can prove a lot to the rest of the world in terms of governance, in terms of cooperation between Europe and the Korean Peninsula with Republic of Korea and Asian countries. Thanks again. For those of you who can stay on, we will stay online. And for those of you who have to leave, because this is now time to leave, I say goodbye, and I wish to keep in touch with all of you. Thank you very much again. Maëlle, if you want to take the floor and maybe take questions or reflect some of the questions.
Are there some speakers that can stay a bit longer? Because we have actually lots of questions from our different participants. So if it's fine for you. So I'm asking, and don't hesitate to tell me if you have to go, and we totally understand the issue. So we had another question from David Camru, asking, South Korea is a major investor in Southeast Asia, like for example, Samsung in Vietnam. Do these investments and the accompanying looking south diplomatic activity have the same thrust as they do for China, namely helping the Southeast Asian countries balance against the PRC? If so, where does Europe come in? Are there some researchers that want to take the floor?
Maybe I can say a couple of words about that. I wouldn't characterize the shifting investments of South Korean, but also Japanese companies towards Southeast Asia as mainly driven by the need or by the wish to support Southeast Asian countries to balance against China. It's their own investment opportunity, and rather it's South Korea and Japan trying to diversify their investments. Samsung has decided that very early on, already 2 or 3 years ago, and is moving quickly on that. I think there's no longer a Samsung factory in China in large scale. So they have moved on to other places, and that's a longer term trend of the recomposition of production networks and supply chains. The effect of that might be that Southeast Asia is becoming a little bit less depending on China, but this also depends, of course, on Chinese companies, and they invest also a lot there. So I don't see that there's really a balancing effect to a large degree visible at the moment.
Okay, thank you a lot, Dr. Meyer, for this very interesting answer. So we have another question from Wolf Pei. We're saying there is little mention of the trilateral secretariat in Seoul. Can the EU integration serve to improve the often contentious relation of the three neighbors in East Asia with their paradox of success in trade and foreign direct investments, but few exchanges at political level? Does someone want to answer that?
I think I can go for it because I have some on my paper on trilateral cooperation and the trilateral cooperation secretariat. In essence, I mentioned the idea of medical equipment swap lines. Now we have here an opportunity for EU-South Korea cooperation. Why? Because the idea of regionalizing these medical equipment swap lines, in other words, making it available to Japan, China, and South Korea, is actually coming from South Korea. So South Korea, again, is taking the lead, as it used to be in the past, to create momentum for regional integration and trust building among the three Northeast Asian nations. And I think we have an opportunity from an European point of view to link up to these proposals coming from South Korea, because the European Union has not only traditionally supported both politically and financially the trilateral process. So this process of like bringing together China, Japan, and South Korea. But it is also like the right moment to show that the European Union can be a political actor in Northeast Asia. We usually have a criticism of the European Union, which is a trade and investment giant, but a political dwarf. Now, here there is the opportunity. The South Koreans are available to do more things with the European Union in the regional context, not only in the bilateral context. So I think it's an incredible opportunity. It needs some courage, especially from the European side, to put aside possible American criticism, because we know that the moment we support trilateral cooperation, we I wouldn't say disturb, but we impinge on the system of alliances of the United States in Asia. So the European Union sometimes is reluctant to do certain things in Asia because of the system of alliances. But as we know in Europe, we believe that regional integration can bring some benefits. So I think we should also be less cautious and be more bold in bringing forward the support to trilateral cooperation, especially when it comes to the Asians. So thank you.
Thank you a lot, Dr. Casarini, for this very enlightening answer. Maybe we can ask two last questions from our different participants. So,
I just add
yeah, sure.
A little something.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. I would just like to go a little further than Professor Casarini, because I completely agree with what has been said, and I think that the point indeed is very important, because one role the European Union can play in this situation is to avoid that the trilateral cooperation secretariat turns to be more a matter of competition than cooperation. So that means that the region is stuck in diverging ambitions, distrust among the players. And as Professor Casarini just brilliantly explained, in the European Union can act as a catalyst, indeed, to go further than just investment and trade, and create indeed a path for deeper cooperation. And I think it's a very important point which has been raised here, is that if the European Union can play this role, I think it's very important, because otherwise there is the fear that the threat that the TCS remains just an empty body, just locked because of these diverging ambitions and this mutual distrust. So the European Union definitely can play a very active role, and the remark made by Professor Casarini, I think, is of prime importance in this matter.
Thank you very much for this adding information, Mr. André. So I have maybe a question for Dr. Dekker, because as you're mentioning the digital connectivity between the EU and South Korea, don't you think that a cultural and political difference between the two actors prevents the European member states from being as innovative as South Korea within the digital field? For example, in France, people are suspicious about data protection and are also taking into account the environmental impact of 5G and 6G. So what is your opinion about this issue? Oh, wait, did Mrs. Dekker leave before? Oh yeah, sorry. Mrs. Dekker is not here anymore for answering this question. So I'm going to ask maybe a last one. It's more in relation to normative values. So are there some aspects of South Korea's democracy that could be a lesson for all the European and maybe declining democracies? What could be the different ways for the EU to associate more deeply with the arc of Asian democracies in the coming years? So is there someone who wants to answer this question? Dr. Novotna, you want to take the floor?
Yes, perhaps I can just mention something which I find striking when the Europeans look at South Korea and how it's handling, or Asia in general, how it's handling the pandemic crisis, because the sort of the European view is quite often sort of tainted by the experience with the Chinese approach, right? So, you know, the Europeans tend to say, well, you know, China as a strong authoritative state can just impose all the restrictions on its citizens. But the Europeans quite often forget how well South Korea and Taiwan, and we could perhaps say Hong Kong as well, dealt with the pandemics, and dealt with emphasis on transparency, on democracy. We shouldn't forget that South Korea was the first country to hold national elections during the pandemic with the highest turnout since 20 years. And that actually these populations sort of do not dispute the measures taken by the South Korean governments, not because it would be an authoritative system, but because the citizens basically trust the leadership provided by Moon's administration or Tsai Ing-wen's administration in Taiwan. So it's not that the sort of idea that Asia can deal with the pandemic better because we have this hierarchical Confucianist whatever societies, but it is because these countries have trust in their leaders, trust in their management, trust in the way in which the government runs the pandemic response, and that response is based on democratic measures. So we could possibly discuss also things about data privacy and things like that, but I think we should sort of, in terms of norms, look at South Korea and Taiwan especially as examples of democratic way of responding to pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Dr. Novotna. So I think we already used all the time we had at our disposition. So maybe we are going to end this webinar. Thank you again for all your speeches that were very, very interesting. And for the remaining participants, we are going to have a YouTube live, so you will be able to rewatch the webinar. So thank you a lot, all of you, and bye. And stay safe, and see you, I hope, on the next event together to deal again with EU broad cooperation and relations.
Hopefully in person. Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.